we're going to go ahead and move on to Dr. Smith's talk. So our next speaker is Dr. Adam Smith, and Adam is a practicing physician who has cultivated his work as a physician development coach and mindfulness educator since moving to Austin after a decade at Yale working in clinical and administrative roles. He currently balances his consulting work with clinical work for Crossover Health and at the Apple Wellness Center. So Adam, thanks so much for joining us today, and I've been looking forward to your talk.
Great, thanks Brian for the introduction. Good morning, everybody. Let me get things started here. All right. Okay, so again, good morning. We've covered a lot this morning for those who may have joined a little later. We'd heard from Lauren, who touched on communication and authenticity. Tom had joined us and shared a little bit about the power of words and meaningful communication. And Kristen, of course, just chatted with us about self-compassion and mindfulness. And today, I'm going to share with you a bit of an amalgam of all of that. And the idea is that hopefully you'll have some things you can take away with you at the end of today to take into your practice on Monday, as Brian was just talking about, that hopefully will make our experience better at the bedside. So at the intersection of mindfulness and medicine is this body of scientific theories and fields known as coaching psychology. I was introduced to coaching psychology shortly after I turned pro and was working primarily as a hospital-based internist, and was finding that there were people who were returning to the hospital as they do to our outpatient practices, which is where I spend the majority of my time these days, with the same issues. And I was looking for ways to connect with my patients in a different way that would help me access their own sources of motivation. And I realized in learning these skills of coaching psychology during my work of becoming a coach myself, that a lot of these skills could be applied to me in my work. And as I got patients on board, I found that returning them to my colleagues who had not quite made a similar shift was challenging for the patients. So that's where this work began, and the framework that I'll share with you today. So coaching psychology in a nutshell helps make these concepts of self-compassion and mindfulness, empathy, authenticity, not only accessible, but ideally practical to our lives and our work, and specifically as it relates to personal well-being and the goal of seminar today. So today, I'm going to share with you a framework and an approach that can help us maintain our connection to both our patients and ourselves, and hopefully help us preserve some meaning and enjoyment in our work. So if you think about our history in physical and the history of present illness, these are structured in a way that help us as physicians organize and communicate our information consistently. So this process that I call Better at the Bedside provides a structure to support our communication with patients. But before we can effectively communicate, we really have to connect with our audience. And in this case, that's our patients, but it's also ourselves. So I ask you to keep two things in mind over the next 30 minutes or so as we go through some of this material. And those two questions are: what connects us to our work? And how do we connect to ourselves while we do our work? And there's a bonus question that I'll throw in there, which is to ask ourselves, how committed and attached are you to your way of doing things? And what might it take to make a shift in your approach? So there are obvious barriers to personal connection that need no introduction. One is time. The majority of clinicians that I work with are in 15-minute encounter slots, or maybe a 20-minute urgent care slot where there's really no existing relationship. And then of course there's technology, where pre-COVID there was a computer on the wall that was often coming between the patient, and now pre-COVID and with the incorporation of telemedicine, of course there's a computer that is actually in between us. But more than that, there's this third factor, and I feel that it's perhaps the bigger barrier, which is the paradigm of our medical training. Because as we've talked about today, medicine isn't just about fixing anymore, it's about enabling the well-being of our patients. And as we've talked about, enabling our own well-being. So in the early days of Western medicine, our current model worked well. There was an acute problem, there was a well-defined solution, and we had surgery in the early days, and then we had an antibiotic solution a little later. And that quick fix, what I call this quick fix expert-based model, worked really well for those types of issues. But it doesn't work as well in today's culture, where, as I mentioned earlier, the majority of our illnesses are related to behavioral choices. So how we connect with our patients becomes even more important. And I use this word paradigm intentionally here because you can think of paradigms essentially as goggles that we wear that color everything. They're really the lens that we use to view the world. And those views or those patterns of thoughts and beliefs form the sources of our attitudes and behaviors. And as Tom was talking about, this informs the language and tone in our approach when we're approaching patients, and as Kristen mentioned, when we're approaching ourselves. So these attitudes and behaviors really form the foundation of our relationships, and that plays a role in patient outcomes and the performance piece that you saw on the title slide. Now, many training program that I went through, while somewhat progressive in that it incorporated a biopsychosocial model and some things like motivational interviewing, was still primarily a physician-centered paternal approach to patient care. And what I've learned is that this approach creates its own barriers to patient connection and to personal connection. And we can think of personal connection simply as job satisfaction. So helping physicians shift their perspective toward a patient-centered, more collaborative approach can benefit both our relationship with our patients, but also our relationship with ourselves. So while I don't think anyone would argue that we need a new health system, and we need a new health system to be sure, I started to develop an understanding of these skills so that I had something to work with in the meantime. So we can cultivate a new approach to care, and that's what I'll share a little bit about with you now. So the question is, how do we do that? So we enter this body of field and study that's been around, I'd say 80 years formally. So by incorporating these key aspects of coaching psychology into our clinical practice, we can make these concepts a little bit more practical and relevant to our everyday practice. You can see here on the slide, these are just a few of the scientific areas, the areas of psychology that are under the umbrella of coaching psychology. Trans-theoretical model, which we use with smoking cessation, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is traditional talk therapy, appreciative inquiry, which helps remind us to focus on what may be working well for the patient in addition to what might not be working well, and then motivational interviewing, which most of us have had some exposure to. So let's start with the definition of coaching psychology. I'm a fan of this definition, and I'll just read it out loud. The coaching psychology is the science of relationships designed to optimize health and well-being. I think this is a pretty good definition of medicine, and what I like about it is it allows us to begin to modernize our concept of medicine by adding it to our traditional definition of diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of disease. More than that, coaching psychology helps us bring attention and awareness to not only what we do, but to how we do it and how we feel doing it. And we've heard quite a bit about this today. And In a nutshell, it's really about learning to improve, if not master, our own situational awareness and our presence of mind so that we know how we're doing at any given moment. And the main reason for that is so that we don't end up acting like jerks while in service to the people who've come to us for help. So there are 4 pillars of coaching psychology. There's rapport, relational skills, being skills, and values. And we're going to go through these in just a moment. So these areas, these concepts, I invite you to think about as skills to optimize our personal effectiveness. And I like to make a distinction here between effectiveness and efficiency. And one of the things about this process and internalizing these concepts is that effectiveness doesn't have to come at the expense of efficiency. But I find that the efficiency focus, which is what the majority of traditional practices are built around, does tend to come at the expense of effectiveness because it really works in direct conflict with opportunities to develop those relationships that are important and add meaning to our work. And as we've heard about already today, just to meet basic human needs, not to mention the opportunity to enjoy some spontaneous moments in our work. So the first pillar has to do with rapport, establishing that connection with our patients. The first is paying full attention, which is pretty self-explanatory. Being free of distraction. The second, looking for areas of celebration. Now this is more than just sending out a card to the patient on their birthday. This is really, as I mentioned earlier, just a few moments ago, about making space for what's working well in the context of what might not be working well. And it may sound like a good example would be, it sounds as though you're doing the best that you can with what you've got. A simple point of validation in the setting of what the patient is sharing with you can help build that rapport and that connection and a little trust. And then as we've also, I think it was Lauren who touched on this earlier, this idea of slowing down. And I'm not talking about slowing down the time on the clock. We're talking about slowing down the pace of the visit, because that really creates space for connection. And where the rubber meets the road, there is a question on the consumer assessment for healthcare providers and systems, the CAP scores, which specifically addresses perceived time spent with patients. So in a pre-COVID world, something as simple as sitting versus standing can make a difference to that perceived quality of time without adding time to the visit. And now in our COVID world, I find that something as simple as showing your hands while you're having that conversation can have a similar effect. Second is relational skills. And this gets into the bucket of motivational interviewing. So you may have had some exposure to this before. Open-ended inquiry is simply asking a patient at the top of the visit, how are you doing? Versus launching into a bullet point review of systems checklist, for instance. And then mindful listening and perceptive reflections. We've heard a lot about mindfulness today, and we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But mindful listening in a practical sense is just simply listening well enough so that you can paraphrase back to the patient what they've told you. I find that this is not only helpful to let the patient know that you've heard them, of course, but it also makes it really a lot easier to write a succinct HPI when you get to the documentation portion of the visit. If you've heard them, been able to paraphrase back to them, allowed them to hear what they've said to you in their own words. And then we can typically summarize things within about 3 to 4 sentences rather than taking notes during that conversation. I find that that's been very helpful, not only for me, but with clients. And another rubber meets the road area is that question 16 on that CAP score specifically has to do with listening. So each of these areas has some relevance in terms of performance and broader impacts on compensation. So rapport and relational skills take us into being skills. So being skills is really just how we show up. How do we meet the patient and what is the energy that we're bringing into the room or to the visit, given that we're conducting telemedicine visits a lot of the time these days. I encourage my smart, skeptical clients for whom being skills and mindfulness may be either uncomfortable or suspect, to think of being skills and mindfulness as a way for us to generate self-awareness. I do think that there are a lot of aspects of our training that really breed this ability out of us. So I do think it's helpful to spend some time, again, as we've been talking about today, and by virtue of the fact that we're here talking about it, it's helpful to develop these skills, and these are skills that can be learned. When we talk about empathy, which we have that Kristen just shared with us a little bit about, from a practical standpoint, I think of empathy as simply considering someone's circumstance, and I find that this is a skill that changes the way, or helps us change the way that we see the world of our patients. And when we combine the empathy with self-awareness, we're really building that foundation of emotional intelligence. And there's good evidence for each of the things presented on these slides that show that self-awareness supports improved communication and can help prevent our own overextension or burnout in our work. Thirdly, on this slide is this word authenticity, which is often difficult to define, and we've gotten some good insight into that over the course of the morning. We've talked about authenticity as being the absence of ego in our work. I like to think of that as doing right over having to be right. So doing right over being right. And perhaps most importantly, with respect to authenticity, is knowing that it's okay not to know the answer. So as I commonly say to patients, or to my physician colleagues rather, I remind myself by remembering that just because I don't have a diagnosis doesn't mean that I can make a plan. So I can partner with the patient, and that reminds me also that I'm not alone in this, that I'm in this together with my patient. And I can also expand that. I can also expand that space to include my colleagues, and that can make our days much less onerous when viewed from that perspective. To riff on mindfulness for a moment, this schematic comes from our colleagues at the Harvard School of Management. Mindfulness has been adopted by a number of industries outside of medicine. And what I like about this schematic is that it points out that mindfulness helps us improve our ability to pay attention, hearkening back to what we've been talking about with rapport and relational skills, and that ability to focus our attention consistently does improve these downstream effects in the functional domains of cognition and emotion and behavior and physiology that Kristen had touched on earlier. And then again, where the rubber meets the road for us in these buckets of performance and relationships and personal well-being. You may recognize a few of these companies that have adopted mindfulness alone as a focus and an opportunity for their employees, and they've supported these programs in different ways. One statistic I'll share with you before moving on is that Aetna calculated that productivity gains were somewhere in the neighborhood of $3,000 per employee, just with a mindfulness program. Specifically, I believe it was MBSR training implemented throughout their program. So it'd be really nice to see maybe the AMA or perhaps a less controversial representation of medicine upon that dashboard at some point. So we've talked about rapport, relational skills, being skills. We're going to land on the fourth pillar, the fourth area of values. So values take their lead from authenticity, and they allow us to share our point of view, share our convictions constructively while making room for patient preference. So I also like to think of this in terms of cognitive flexibility. Just gives us a little bit of room. We talked about doing right versus being right a minute ago. So again, we're following that lead with respect to the patient's values and what's important to them, even if we might not agree with the patient. And that can be challenging for a lot of us to make room for that. what I find so important about this values piece is that it can move us, it can really help move us toward a participatory model, and what in the psychology literature is referred to as a patient's internal locus of control. And you can see on the slide here this term attitudinal symmetry, which has to do with where do we find places in common with patients. So here in Austin or in Texas in general, if you're both Longhorn fans, you might connect around that point. But oftentimes, how do you do that, especially with a new patient in 15 minutes? How do you establish rapport and connection in real time? So that's what these concepts help us do. And I think just as importantly, they can also help move us away from, I would argue, outdated concepts such as the non-compliant patient, by acknowledging that people have life circumstances that we might simply not fully understand yet. So I encourage myself to keep one thing in mind when I'm initiating a conversation with a patient, and that's to first do my best to understand where they're coming from and pay attention to not only what I can do for them, but how I can be with them during the visit. You can see I've got a formula here, which I do my best to keep in mind, which is essentially that perspective, both for myself and for my patients, is really the sum of a person's capacity and their resources in the context of their circumstances. So keeping that formula in mind helps me to create a workable plan, both for myself in real time in terms of how I'm showing up, but also for the patients and what they're capable of. So rapport, relational skills, being skills, and values make up this body of coaching psychology. And all of these skills rest upon this foundation of self-care, which we've heard a lot about today. And we know that science tells us what we know intuitively to be true, which is that taking better care of ourselves allows us to take better care of others. So I like to frame it this way, which is that without self-care, there is no healthcare. We've talked a lot about self-compassion in the past hour. We know that it creates empathy and compassion for others, and that without that, our work and our work experience suffers. We call that burnout. And then when we are feeling that way, that gets paid forward to the experience of our patients in the form of poorer outcomes and lower satisfaction ratings. So we've already encouraged each other to go to the bathroom. We've encouraged each other to eat lunch. And I really believe that we do owe it to ourselves to do these things. We owe it to not only ourselves, but our family and our patients, because at the end of the day, we're simply nicer people when we do those things. Kristen mentioned shared the analogy of the airplane and putting the mask on ourselves before helping others. And I've shared that analogy with colleagues and clients before. And occasionally people will find some holes to poke in that approach, but there's one example that I found has been essentially bulletproof. And I find that the human body gives us a great example in diastole. So Kristen asked the question are we selfish for doing these things? And I think if you ask the heart, is it selfish for being kind to itself, for taking the blood that it needs to support everyone else? The clear answer is no. And it helps me reframe and reorient my own practice around this idea that self-care supports my capacity to connect to the heart of my work consistently. And that doesn't have to take the form of running for 30 minutes, 5 days a week. It's about finding those moments that work for you. And I find that another helpful way to think about self-care is to consider the concept of margin. Margin is another term that's used across industries to define the space between our loads and our limits. It's this gap between rest. We were talking about taking naps earlier, and this idea of work-life balance, and whether that's really an accurate term to help define what's most helpful to us at work. It's really finding balance at work and working through what that is for you. And it's a little bit different for each of us. So it's really the opposite of overload. And this idea of margin supports self-awareness and as we've talked about today, it can be developed. The opposite of all of this is this idea of scarcity, of not having enough, or there's not enough sleep, not enough time. And scarcity takes a real toll on us, and it robs us of insight. And when we don't have that space to shift our perspective, it also impacts things like resilience and some of the other terms that we've heard a lot about in the wellness literature with respect to the work that we do. And so let's take a look in the next 10 minutes or so at some practical tools and techniques. So how are these concepts that we've just talked about relevant? How can we apply them in our daily work? So this is a traditional health coaching script, and we're not going to spend a lot of time going through all of this, but I do want to bring your attention to the words in bold here. Collaboration, permission. You heard Tom in his language during his presentation asking permission to share something with us rather than simply delivering the information. Exploring motivation, strengths, values. We talked about support structures, circumstances, and is specific to coaching and what I'm about to share on this idea of competence and commitment on the behalf of patients. So the take-home message from a traditional health and wellness coaching perspective is that a change in language and tone can really create a different kind of relationship. And it can create a different relationship for the patient with us, but it can also help us create a different relationship with ourselves in real time in facilitating that connection. So this sets the stage for tools such as health confidence measures like this one. So if you're not familiar with health confidence measures, these are essentially used as proxies for connection. And I would say proxies for meaningful connection. And depending on how large this is on your screen, you can see that this particular card, this is essentially a handout that was developed at Dartmouth about 3 or 4 years ago to assess these ideas and how effective and important are the ideas of understanding and the confidence that a patient has to carry out a plan. So this particular card asks 2 questions. It says, how understandable is the information that you received from your clinician? And how confident are you that you can carry out that information? And they essentially ranked their level of understanding and confidence on a scale of 1 to 10. What they found in some 69 primary care settings is that health confidence measure was the critical, or I should say that health confidence in general was the critical measure with respect to how well patients did. And you can see here in a lot of the areas where we are constantly working in outpatient primary care with exercise, diet, and blood sugar management, that those who ranked in the upper third had significantly better outcomes. And the take-home message is that the quality of the information, not surprisingly, improves a patient's ability to adhere to recommendations. And then the performance piece is not only how well they're doing, but also how well it appears we're doing in our work. And that quality of information comes from the connection and the relationship that we form with our patients. So the question that this brings up for me is that if this much can be achieved with a handout at the end of a visit, I ask that you imagine what a change in our approach could accomplish. And at the heart of coaching psychology really is an invitation to do things a little bit differently. So as I mentioned at the beginning, in traditional health and wellness coaching, we're trained to explore with patients how they can better engage themselves around their behavior. When we integrate this coaching model into our own clinical practice, we're exploring how we can better engage ourselves around our behavior. And one way I found it's helpful for me to do that is to think about how a financial planner approaches a client. So some clients have more or less time or money to invest, but they've got a goal. They want to retire comfortably. Now, when we apply this perspective to that of a wellness planner, for lack of a better term, the relationship does change. So ideally, we share a goal for the patient. Ideally, that's their stated goal. But what changes is that now we're free to collaborate with them and create a plan that's based not so much on this expert-based model in terms of what they should do, but rather what they're able to do given their circumstances that's going to be a positive step. And this echoes back to this idea of one simple change that enables us to build some momentum. And over time, whether that's 2 or 3 or 4 visits, we can build some trust with the patient and share our ideas freely and incorporate it together into an actionable plan. So this really is the essence of shared decision-making and reminds us to consider, again, those key points of capacity, resource, and circumstance. Another way to do this in real time is to reframe the visit so it has meaning and purpose for us. And what this looks like, to use a very simple example, is something like this. So I don't know how many of you may have ever been annoyed with a patient. That has happened to me on numerous occasions, and I look for ways to reorient myself again to the need of the person in front of me. So in this example, this is a patient who comes into the clinic, primary care office, who may have woken up with a sore throat that morning. And what I've observed in a lot of the shadow coaching work is that there's this initial pang of irritation where the thought that's in the clinician's head or in my head is, who on earth comes to the doctor before trying anything? What I've found very helpful is that we can reframe that response, not only the thought, but to actually say it out loud to the patient, something like, so it sounds as though you're looking for some guidance on how to best manage your symptoms. This helps reorient me around things that I enjoy, which is education and to truly be in service to the person that has come to me for help. And importantly, helps me avoid this, what I call this pitfall of negativity. And I ask that we remember, and it reminds me that this is an approach that supports both of us when we do these things. And while a lot of the outcomes measures and focus of the triple aim that organizations are being measured against has to do with the patient experience, I remind myself that the heart of the work really has to do with our experience as physicians, because it is our experience that invariably gets paid forward to the patient. And when unchecked, this negativity gets passed along in the form of despondence, as we've talked about already today, this idea of not being caring, or dismissal. The doctor was hurried, was disinterested. So I encourage you to have a way, for all of us to have a way to check in with ourselves, something that we can root back to in those moments where we're feeling challenged in our work. The questions that I ask myself are, am I being helpful and supportive? And how can I be helpful and supportive? Because I really can't be helpful and supportive if I'm not in that frame of mind. And I find that knowing how to right ourselves in any given situation really does become a superpower for our own well-being, that can in turn be paid forward to everyone else. And I find that is a central concept that's core to the success of our own experience in our work. So how can we more fully integrate all of this into our practice? How can we build a quality connection consistently? Well, I would ask, how do we do anything consistently? We talked about our history and physical structure. We've talked about the history of present illness. And we do that by building a framework to guide us. So here, this is where I introduce what I call the embodied clinical script. And this takes us through key points of value and understanding in a consistent way. So it brings the mindset and the mechanics, both the concepts and our words and our actions together in something that we can consistently follow. And it also provides us a way to curate our visit so that we know where we are at any given point in time and conversation in any issue during the visit. And when we're dealing with a visit that may be 10 or 15 minutes in its total length, which gives us 7 or 8 minutes, this is also a huge stress reducer if the patient begins to wander in a story, if it feels like it's going on too long, it gives us the opportunity to gently interrupt or redirect back to the point where we want to re-enter the conversation to make sure that we touch on these key points of connection. So we won't unpack this today, but I just want to bring us back to the slide that we saw in the beginning so we can begin to see where all of this starts to come together. And when we open this up a bit, we can see how self-care is supporting each of these pillars and these concepts that we've talked about of rapport and relational skills and being skills, and in general provides us with a uniform structure, both for connection and for the flow of the visit. And here's where that scripting comes in, informed by each of these components of the coaching psychology that I've shared with you today. So essentially providing us with a communication tool that improves our effectiveness and our efficiency, and supports not only better communication with the patient, as we've talked about, but better communication and awareness in terms of how we're feeling. And that supports better experiences and outcomes for our patients and ourselves in our work. So as Kristen and others have touched on this morning, this too is a practice. This takes time to integrate, become familiar with, and isn't something that I would expect someone to hit the ground running on Monday morning with all of this internalized. So I do like to ask people to keep just a few things in mind that you can take into your practice and begin to experiment with to see how it changes things for you. And the first is this core idea of seeking first to understand, essentially listening first before sharing our thoughts, even if it's pretty clear based on our experience what may have brought them in. Second is reframing the visit to have meaning and purpose for us. As we talked about, this idea of providing a point of validation either for the patient or finding a way to connect in a way that's meaningful for us.